A couple of weeks ago I found myself in a strange place. It was muggier and more humid than I'm used to, although I was told that it's not normally like that at this time of year. It wasn't ridiculously humid. I'd been to Venice in the middle of summer before, and that was so humid that it was actually affecting my breathing. This was tolerable, but I could tell that I was in a foreign country. It would have been out of place in England. There were crows in the park, and they looked and walked and congregated just like normal crows, but I could have sworn that they made slightly higher-pitched noises. The grass was a weird colour. It seemed a little bit yellowish and sickly. When I looked at the paving slabs, the ants seemed smaller and wispier than I was used to. This actually struck me more than anything else at this point. I'd never seen an ant that skinny. If there'd been a swarm of them, I wouldn't have been able to tell one from the next. My girlfriend pointed out this tree surrounded by scaffolding and said that it was a phone mast or something like that. None of it was real. It was a completely artificial tree, from bark to branches to needles. She said they did that to stop them being such an eyesore in the neighbourhood. I was confused because it was surrounded by scaffolding, which seemed to defeat the point. She said they weren't normally surrounded by scaffolding. I was interested in the birds I didn't recognise. This was all a few days after the Queen died and shortly after I recovered from COVID. We went to California to go to a wedding and visit my girlfriend's parents, both of which I was very grateful to be invited to. And it was my first time in a different continent. I felt like going to the US was a bit like going to a different time period, not because it's particularly futuristic or stuck in the past or anything, but because I didn't know which things would feel different and which things would be familiar from television and which wouldn't. I was surprised that crows seemed different, which my friend in Colorado has since confirmed that he agrees with. So in the UK, in my experience, crows make a very limited selection of sounds. They mostly, as far as I've heard, make calls, whereas ravens make more hissing and clicking sounds. But I found it very difficult to find ravens in England. I've probably seen no more than 5 or 6 here in my life. I was in my 20s when I first heard a corvid make a clicking sound in real life, and that was a raven, I think, in Cumbria, on Helvellyn. In Southern California, it seemed like crows make dozens of sounds, including the kind of clicking that I've only ever heard from ravens in the UK. I already knew that the US had birds in the crow family that don't exist in the UK, including these scrub jays.
Woodpecker on the bird feeder.
We were kindly driven by my girlfriend's family out to a national park in the desert. I don't think I checked the temperature more than a couple of times, but in the suburban areas in the desert it felt like the hottest day on record in the UK, which was earlier this year. A really sort of intense dry heat, where even though it's not humid and the air isn't moving much, it feels a bit like you're inside a hairdryer. It was probably about 40 Celsius, which is around 105 Fahrenheit. I think it was about the hottest temperature I've ever experienced, but only by a little bit. In the actual desert, I felt like most of the heat came from the sunlight. I didn't quite feel so much of the hairdryer feeling. I don't remember it being that uncomfortable. I wonder if that's because most of the heat I've experienced has been humid, so actually being able to sweat properly in the dry heat made it more comfortable. There was a sign that warned of bees ahead, and apparently bees will swarm around your car to drink the condensation that comes from the air conditioning. The ground was gritty rather than sandy. The cacti, which are called choya, were weirdly hollow. You could sort of see where some of the limbs had broken off. I'm used to walking in a way that avoids spiky plants because there's lots of gorse in the UK, which is very spiky, but the stakes were higher here because apparently the cactus spikes are difficult to get out once they've gone in you. I knew this in my mind, but I think I probably wasn't being as cautious as I should have been, but luckily I didn't get spiked.
I guess she had to pick up that self-guided tour thing that said, you know. So, ooh.
Do I have another friend?
Yeah, yep. They like you for some reason.
Hey, come to me.
You know, like this.
I'll give you $20 if you catch it.
You'll give me $20.
I would give you $20 if you catch it.
Will you actually?
Yes.
Do you want me to try?
I'm just saying how far I can goad you.
$20. That's like £5.90. Oh, it did not like me getting near it.
How majestic. That's bigger than the other ones we saw.
Oh, up there, I see it.
We were near the Mexican border, and I was able to try some Mexican food actually made by Mexican people for the first time at a home cooking kind of restaurant that I shamefully can't remember the name of. I had some kind of dish with shrimps and mixed up garlic, which was very nice. In my limited experience of Southern California, I didn't find any food that was wildly different to what I'd had in the UK. There were salty snack things that were almost the same as their equivalents in the UK, maybe on average a little bit sweeter, but not much. I didn't have any of the industrial bread, which internationally has quite a bad reputation. I did have some nice locally made bread, which was about as nice as it would have been in the UK, albeit a bit more expensive. Basic produce like vegetables seemed to be maybe cheaper than in the UK, but pre-made things like soups and pre-made meals seemed to be much more expensive. It was surreal to see desert plants in the wild. Obviously in the UK you only ever see them as kind of ornamental plants. There are whole characteristics of plants that I've never seen in the wild. The kind of stiff leaves that succulents have don't really exist natively in the UK as far as I know. You only ever see them on houseplants and things. When I think of desert plants, I usually think of cacti and succulents with sharp blades rather than leaves, but the Mojave actually had some quite nice flowers, which I wasn't expecting. I kept seeing hummingbird moths, which are moths that fly like hummingbirds, but at first the only ones I could catch on camera were dead ones. Eventually I found a live one that stayed in one place long enough for me to film it. Hummingbird moths do actually exist in the UK, but it's so unusual to see them that I bet most British people don't even know they exist. I've only seen two here in my life, and my grandmother said she saw one once when she was in her 70s and had no idea what it was. Oh, did you see the caterpillar?
What?
There's a massive caterpillar.
Catacomb. Cocoon fell off. maybe.
There were lots of lizards in the desert, some of them slightly bigger than what you'd find in the UK. In England it's quite unusual to see lizards unless you're really watching out for them and you're in the right place at the right time, but in the desert it was hard to walk for 10 minutes without seeing one. I didn't see any snakes, but then I wasn't there all that long. I saw these Gambel's quails which were mentioned on a sign in a gift shop, and I also saw another scrub jay. We went to a date farm and I got some footage of a lizard eating what looks like a cockroach or a cicada. It let me get surprisingly close to it, but until I put this clip next to the other clips I took in the desert, I didn't realise how loud the cicadas in the background were. We couldn't see any living cicadas, but we found some husks attached to date trees. I don't know if they were shed skins or something, but they definitely weren't alive. In Britain there are crickets that make humming noises like that, but they're normally much quieter, although they're also quite hard to see. After that we took a plane to Northern California to Oakland Airport in the San Francisco Bay Area. While we were flying over California, I noticed how grid-like the field systems were. When we landed in the shuttle to the car rental place, my body felt like the holiday was over. The weather was so similar to autumn weather in the UK. It was grey, but not in an ominous way, just in a bland way. The temperature was neutral, maybe on the cold side of neutral, and the air didn't smell or feel any different to how it does in a UK suburb. We went for a walk around UC Berkeley, where my girlfriend went to university. At first it seemed a lot like a UK campus university, nicely laid out with stretches of green space between buildings. It smelt a lot more piney because there were conifers everywhere. I'd been told about these fox squirrels which looked like UK grey squirrels but appreciably bigger. Not huge, but if you saw one in the UK you'd probably say that's a big squirrel. And they had reddish patches, more obviously than grey squirrels do. Near a building that I can't remember the name of, for the second time in the trip and the first time on camera, I saw a hummingbird. Hummingbirds don't live in the UK, and I don't think I'd ever seen one before I came to the US. I'd seen them in Attenborough documentaries, but I'd always thought they looked computer-generated, and even in person I still think they look computer-generated. Their movements are very mechanical and surreal. After that we drove up into the hills around Berkeley. Some of the roads were the steepest I've ever been driven on. It was almost scary going up them, and as we got further and further into the hills, the weather got more and more like Cumbrian weather. I remember comparing it to the weather I'd experienced in Inverness at first, windy and cold and with a similar fresh smell in the air. Now as the rain got heavier and heavier, parts of the forest overlooking Berkeley started to really remind me of Cumbria. I'd been warned about this beforehand. If people from the UK visit California, it's often to go to the beach and get some sun, but a lot of coastal northern California is actually pretty similar to Britain weather-wise, although it gets hotter further inland. I think a named storm had recently been through Berkeley, and I was told this weather was unusual for September and would be more normal for winter, but yeah, it was comfortably within the range of normal UK weather in autumn. We travelled to Lake Tahoe, which is a very large lake about 4 hours inland of Berkeley by car. We'd been planning to go hiking in Emigrant Wilderness, but unexpected snowfall meant it would be too dangerous, so my girlfriend's parents very, very kindly helped us to reorganise, and we ended up in Tahoe. The drive there took us through a hotter part of Northern California and then into a more forested area. Although the conifers were mostly familiar, there was something about this stream that just looked unlike anything I've seen in Britain. I spent part of the drive trying to work out what it was. It was just a sort of combination of how unkempt and strewn with rocks and trees it looked, and how close it was to the road, and how it ran straight through dense forest. None of these things are, unheard of in the UK in and of themselves. It was just something about the combination of them. It just looked American. A lot of the hills we drove through also looked unfamiliar. Britain gets misty, but the shape of the clouds isn't normally this obvious, this close to the ground, at least in England. I was at an elevation I'd never been at before. I don't think I'd ever been at a high enough elevation to cause altitude sickness before, and I think maybe this was just about high enough to cause altitude sickness. I think it was about 7,000 feet. In the place we were staying, I started to notice that it was taking longer than usual to get my breath back after doing something strenuous, and even if I talked for too long, I found myself having to catch my breath. It confused me a little bit until I realised it was probably because the air was thinner at this elevation. We went for a short hike along one shore of the lake. The forest landscape was in a lot of ways different from what I've seen in Britain. The trees and torn open logs and rocks came together in an unfamiliar way. Very blue. The lake itself was beautiful. In many ways, a lake is a lake. We have lakes in the UK, and although this one was very big, it didn't feel like I was seeing anything startlingly new, with one exception. The water was very, very blue, and I think that's because it was glacial water. While we walked, we saw a couple of new birds. We saw and heard a few Steller's jays, one of which I got on camera, and these are the blue jays with the kind of tufts on their heads. I volunteered a bit on a living history farm in Britain while they were making a tree rights workshop out of oak, and I helped a bit with cutting shingles, and I remember this beach next to Tahoe smelled faintly of freshly cut wood, which makes sense because there was ripped open wood lying around everywhere. We could hear a raven from the beach, which was sitting in a dead tree, and it's just about visible in this shot, and as we got closer we realised there was a pair of them. As I said earlier, it's very unusual to see ravens in England, so I always thought of them as very mysterious things that live in very remote places and you only ever see one or two at a time, almost like a witch that lives in a particular place in the wilderness far away from civilization, and you're lucky if you come across her house. So it was nice to be in a place where it was more easy to sort of come across them. A couple of days later we went on an overnight hike into the High Sierra near Lake Tahoe. The High Sierra really was strange. In these recordings, please excuse my heavy breathing. I'll leave it to people who've done this hike before to judge my fitness level, but my only excuse is that I was at highish altitude compared to what I'm used to. The first part of the hike wasn't too mad, although there were these strange kind of yellow and pink pine cones lying around in certain places. The pine cones I've seen in the UK have mostly been brown and woody, like a lot of the pine cones in California were. In places, steam was visibly rising from logs and trees, which I've hardly ever seen in the UK. I don't know if I've ever seen it, actually. All around the Tahoe area, on both our walks, the most unfamiliar thing was the vegetation. It's not that there were just different species of plant. I can't really identify many plant species in the UK anyway. It's that there were whole different formats of plant. There were lots of these kind of carpets of small green waxy leaves. There were similar carpets of red leaves, and I think they were just red because it was autumn. It was much more common to see huge bits of conifer just ripped into pieces, and the flesh of the trees seemed to be bright orange in a lot of cases. I haven't enhanced any of the footage of the trees here. The weirdest vegetation to me were these leaves sticking out of the ground, which I was told are called mule's ears. They were shaped a bit like smaller leaves we have here in the UK, but they were really big and dry and papery. There were some familiar things as well. Thistles similar to these grow a lot in the UK. So big. It's so big and far away that it looks like a flat skybox or something. I think that's a raven. There was an area that we found a little bit of snow that was far enough into the shade that it had survived the morning sun. Some of the trees were bent over apparently because they'd been squashed under snowdrifts when they were younger. I've never seen that in the UK, although big snowdrifts do develop in some places. The closest I've seen is trees that are bent over as if they're windswept, and I've always assumed that was because they were blown in one direction, a lot of saplings, but I don't know if that's true. It's starting to smell a bit like a botanical garden. Like this is beginning to smell like a different country rather than just a pine forest. I say with Anglo-centric perspective. They go click-clack here.
Yep.
I didn't know what they were at first. Where are you? Oh. Oh. I think there's some kind of blue jay feather. There's some... I can't really tell what it is.
There's another one.
Oh.
I don't know what it is either.
This feels weirdly papery. I wonder if I focus on my hand you can see all the bugs. At this point the biting insects didn't seem to be any worse or more numerous than they would be around bodies of water in the UK. The difference was that some of these insects were whining mosquito things. In the UK I don't think I've ever heard the whiny noise that mosquitoes are known for making. I'd only ever heard it in Spain before now. When hiking in certain parts of the US you have to store your food in one of these bear canister things which you can rent from outdoor sports shops. The idea is to stop the bear getting at the food so it doesn't start to think of humans as a source of food. In the UK there are no predators big enough to harm adult humans, so there's no need for these. In California there are no wolves, and I think brown bears have been extinct there for a century or so, but there are still black bears. My girlfriend pointed out that there are unlikely to be any in the area we were camping, but that didn't stop me worrying. It was strange to be in a country where bears were native. All my life, bears have occupied this kind of weird space in my head. They didn't feel exotic in the way that lions do, because there are fairy tales about them living in the forest. They felt halfway between some exotic monster and a local, normal animal. They felt like something that would be at home in England, but just didn't live here anymore, which is true, they went extinct here about 1,500 years ago. But being in an environment where bears were actually a modern occupant was a bit weird to think about, especially since most of the time it didn't feel that different to the UK. There it is, the thing that sounds like a drone. Oh, it's the same. I think that's the same kind of thing as we saw earlier. Oh. Maybe I can get a view of it from the other side. With the light on it. Little friend. Looks so dry and dusty. While I've got a lot of footage with no speaking, the environment wasn't the only thing about the US that I found interesting. Some key things were different, and I've been primed for a lot of them by my girlfriend who's from the US and by my friends who have been there before. For one thing, beds are dressed differently. In the UK, you tend to have one duvet that goes over the top of you, and the duvet is inside a thin cover that you wash every so often. In the US, it seems like it's more normal to have several layers of thinner sheets that you can take on and off depending on the temperature, and you wash at least the one that's directly on top of you. Rather than putting milk in coffee, it's more common for people to put in these little pots of something called half and half, which tastes like thin cream. People mostly have machines that make large quantities of coffee at once. In the UK, it's more common to have spoonfuls of instant coffee powder and water-heated electric kettle, which you pour onto the powder. And the kettles in the UK are usually plugged into the wall, whereas in the US it seemed like at least some places had a kettle that you put onto a stove to heat up. The air smells fresh. I mean, my sense of smell's not very good, but it doesn't smell like anything unfamiliar. It smells very clean. Bulbs of weird mossy stuff. Quite hard and rough, like tiny little barnacles or something. The ants here are very big. The ants in San Diego are very small. Well, I think there were big ones in San Diego as well, but... In both parts of California, I saw a few of these rodent things, which I now know are golden-mantled ground squirrels, but at the time I thought they might be chipmunks or something. Most squirrels in the UK are grey squirrels that were introduced from the US. It was interesting to see how the golden squirrels moved mostly like grey squirrels move, except for a few differences. They seem to be quicker and jumpier. I think maybe this is what it was eating. I think it dropped the rest of it here when I do feel bad for scaring it. Kind of exciting animal, but I do need to be a bit more considerate about scaring them. Don't know if you can see, but I think our friend is safe and sound over there. Hopefully with some new delicious food. walk with their tails stuck up. That's really strange. I just put the camera on because I realised that I hadn't shown my face in this video yet, so I thought maybe it'd be nice just to see who's filming. And just as I've turned the camera on, a little squirrely chipmunk thing has just crawled up in that tree right next to me. Well, it's not right next to me, it's a few feet away. So that's what you get for being vain and filming yourself. Probably bored of squirrel things by now anyway. Kind of soft and succulenty. Now that the sun's going down, it's getting a bit chilly. Sitting still, it was almost too uncomfortable to wear what I'm wearing now with the sleeves rolled up. But I don't think it's freezing yet. I think it's probably getting there. This really isn't like anything I've seen in the UK. The closest thing I could think of would be Switzerland, but still, there's a lot of plant life here and animals that don't exist in Switzerland. Even the smell seems a bit fresher than I'm used to. I'm not very good at describing smells. get some other perspectives, I talked to 2 close friends who've been to the US a few times before and who went to the US and Canada recently. Bear in mind that we know there are hundreds of millions of people in the US and a huge amount of cultural diversity, and we don't mean to make generalisations that apply to all people in all places of all backgrounds, but we thought we might talk about some general trends that we noticed in our short spans of time there. I completely acknowledge that these might have been us projecting our expectations onto people, and of course you're welcome to set the record straight in the description if you think that what we're saying doesn't ring true, and hopefully nothing we say upsets people. I don't think any of it would upset me if it was said about me, but that doesn't necessarily mean it won't upset other people. So you went to Seattle and then up to Vancouver.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned, which I found interesting, was the whole the thing about loitering. I didn't realise that loitering wasn't allowed.
Yeah.
My fun experiences.
Yeah, I don't know if it's one of those things where you kind of perceive it that way just because you have in your head, oh, there's the law about loitering.
Yeah.
Or if it is actually. But it did seem like Scott was saying, people kind of, they always have something to do or somewhere to go over there.
Very productive kind of. I think maybe it's also I was just really conscious of whenever I travel somewhere, I hate the idea of being the tourist. If you know what I mean.
That's the thing. I was like that as well.
You don't want to be the one getting the map out with the travel bag and the. So maybe I was just so conscious of that. But I did find that here people just stand around a lot more in the UK. You know, you just see a group of guys just sat on a wall or just stood by, waiting for someone. It seemed out there, if you sort of stood, someone looked at you. Interestingly, it may have just been a string of very strange coincidences. Yeah, precisely. But
I think, I wonder if part of it's to do with the smoking thing, because I don't know if you noticed, but the whole time I was there, I probably only saw one person smoking. I saw one person buying cigarettes.
I didn't really keep an eye out for it, but that's the sound. It seems like more of a UK thing in a way.
Yeah, I think.
We gave a cigarette to
a homeless
guy called Derek.
Yeah.
Where do you have a cigarette?
Oh, we doing a film.
Oh,
thing,
I see. Oh, yeah.
And we couldn't get herbal film cigarettes.
Oh,
so
I
you
see.
Have to buy a real pack of. That was even an interesting exchange.
That's true, actually. What, buying the pack?
Yeah, buying the pack, because
I suppose if you don't know what to ask for, then you just.
Yeah.
I'll have your finest pack of cigarettes, please.
I did get mistaken for being from New Zealand.
Oh, really?
Yeah, a guy asked for my driver's license in this sort of bar restaurant. He said, "Oh, is this are you from New Zealand?" He's like looking at it, like the Union Jack. I was like, "No."
Yeah, when we went last time, there's this guy that thought Dad was from Australia.
Really?
Based on his accent.
Yeah,
that's interesting. I suppose
they cluster more closely together than either of them.
And there are, there's a lot of similarities with like the language we use and stuff. So.
Yeah, that's true.
I found the guns startling. I saw one guy just
you saw some guns.
There's one guy in Port Angeles who had just a Glock just sticking out of his trousers and just crossing the road.
What was that? Sorry.
Oh no, sorry.
I was just going to say I don't think I saw any, but I might just not been looking out for them. I think.
It's weird because obviously police here sometimes, especially more since terror attacks a few years ago, will carry like machine guns and stuff. But I don't know, seeing just a guy in a grocery store walking out with a Glock, just in his waistband completely.
Yeah.
Because I can understand having if someone has one in their car, I'm sure that we must have passed people who have had them in a vehicle.
Oh yeah, I'm sure I did.
But it's interesting because there's that mentality of, I think it's maybe because in the UK we know the kind of the subtleties of character, and so you see someone, let's say someone's walking towards you and they look like they could be a hazard or a threat, right?
Yeah.
There's this weird thing where it's almost like you can kind of perceive their motive somewhat, and I felt that I was stripped of that, and I felt very vulnerable there because I don't know what the cultural, social limits are. You don't know what the social cues are
that mean certain things. That's the thing. Like I was worried, like you say about being a tourist, I was worried about doing something small that would seriously upset someone,
or just like using the wrong word.
Yeah.
And people don't know what you mean, that sort of thing.
Well, I think I mentioned that when, the first time I met a lot of Americans at once when I was doing a dig at Ribchester, one thing was that when when somebody said thank you to them, their response was like an affirmative, like or aha or something like that. And to me, the first time I heard it, it came across as rude.
Yeah, no, I realised that. I noticed that actually a lot.
It sounded like, yeah, you should thank me, but obviously that's just a normal way of responding to thanks. So I didn't want to do the equivalent of that, and then somebody question themselves, sort of, or question whether I was being rude to them or not. No, because there were a couple of times that people didn't understand me, but I think it was probably just because I was buying things from a shop and they didn't expect me to be British, so they were anticipating an American accent, so they didn't, for a second, they didn't understand me.
Did you find this thing, which I thought was quite interesting, which is that it seems to me that, and this is obviously a generalisation, but the sort of general attitude of the people I interacted with on that holiday was very, they were way more assertive than British people. It seemed to me that, not in every case, but it seems...
When I went on the earlier trip and stayed with some Americans in an Airbnb, it was kind of mixed in the same way it would be here, where some people were a bit more bold about things, but others were kind of a little bit quiet and kind of mumbled a bit and stuff.
Yeah.
But almost, like in the sense of, perhaps assertive is the wrong word, and to the point is better, where it's like, it seemed to me that it's more... Like here, it's excuse me, or thank you, or sorry, I cut. Like even like when we talk now, we say, sorry, I cut you off. But out there, it seemed a lot more like, and I'm sure obviously people do that in America, but it seemed a lot more like people had a lot more confidence in themselves. I'm not saying that we don't.
I sort of get that. I think it was people behaved more. I was expecting the behaviour to be more unfamiliar. Like I found a lot of people behaved basically how their British equivalents would behave. But then there was definitely like a slight, like a little bit more directness. And this weird, I found this weird sort of independence. It almost seemed like people seemed a lot more in cities, especially. Now I know this is true in any city, but it seemed like there was sort of, perhaps it was more prominent that they were in certain. No, I don't know what I'm saying. That's fair enough.
What's that trying to think? Because I think we've grown up with so much American media, so much television, film, music, right? That I felt that when we were out there, there's almost like you kind of, it feels like you just switch on to kind of, okay, we're in America now. But what's funny is, because our parents obviously didn't really grow up with much exposure to American media, I noticed that there was people, it seemed to me that a lot of people just didn't quite understand them or their motives, and it's quite, like they'd go to pay for something at checkout and say, "Was this alright? Can we use this card machine or this?" And they'd be like, "Yeah." And like it could have just been specific to those interactions, but it seemed that a lot of times throughout the holiday, and maybe it was going back to the universal tourist thing, because there is that is a thing where it's like, if if you're not from a place, maybe you act a certain way that draws attention to you. But it did seem that there's a lot of things they didn't quite grasp or understand. That's quite interesting to watch.
That is interesting. I found the same kind of thing for me, because it's sort of, when I got there, it sort of hit me that I'd watched so many films and like television programs and stuff that were set there, that I had this idea of what normality was there. That kind of helped,
It did when I first sort of arrived. It does feel almost a bit like you're in a film, or like on a film set or something.
I think the first, like when I was going down into the bit where they check your passports and there was this guy standing there kind of directing people, it did feel strangely like I was in a film.
Also, the accents sound different to me in America than they do in films a lot, because it feels like almost like, I mean, I said this to someone out there, but one person agreed, one person didn't, which is, it almost seems to me that a lot of American characterizations in film almost seem like they're British in the way they're written, but maybe it's because there are a lot of British writers.
And also could be more that because you're more familiar with people in the UK.
Yeah.
That's the way they would act, just with their friends in America, maybe
true.
Something like that.
Yeah, maybe.
I think so, and I think because it's funny because we were doing a little film project, and when we were collaborating with people around our age, there was like, it felt to me that it was just, there was no sort of real difference between just someone you'd chat to out here. But it seemed to be the older generation of people out there, people sort of maybe 30s upwards, seemed to be, to me, quite different than what you see of that sort of age range here. But I think,
Yeah, maybe just the whole sort of globalisation and people just becoming more similar around the world anyway, I guess.
I wonder if anyone's looked into that, because it'd be interesting to see at a certain point, a certain age group of when, you know, let's say the internet kind of took off in the way it did, and that kind of connection, if, you know, there's this sudden increase in people being more universally understanding of each other, because they have shared, because, you know, if you think about it, if you live in a sort of rural place, your exposure as a child is to specific sets of, you know, television shows, radio stations. But if you grow up, let's say, from like late 90s onwards, you kind of, you know, we share in common so many things of what we grew up with. And obviously there are things like Elvis or the Beatles where it's like, you know, that would have been a talking point. But there's so many, you know, these common things.
A lot of shows we watched, or music that was popular, that sort of thing.
And in fact, on the shows, I think the most startling thing to me was probably the advertisements.
You filmed a load of the advertisements, didn't you?
I did. Well, I first became aware of it when I watched the Super Bowl with my uncle, and we stayed up for it. And obviously, football, you do have ads, but you have like quite a bit of playing. Then there'll be an ad break. And it's a few throughout the game. But like American football, it's like a bit of a play, ad break, bit of a play, ad break. And I was like, this is, you know, crazy. And then out there, I mean, me and Tom were saying, one thing that we do appreciate is that some of the British advertising is just painful. And
it's painful.
It's painful to watch, it really is. But out there, although it makes me laugh, like with the amount of drug commercials there are,
the amount of
with like lists, like articles of just horrendous side effects. And then with like pictures of these families all happy, and it's like, you know, may cause internal bleeding. And it's like, but I do think that perhaps there is something about the way they advertise on television in America that's a bit less pretentious.
It's
very direct to that.
And it just says, here's what the product is, here's who it's for, here's why
it's almost more like the adverts, I'd say, from like the 70s in the UK. Where they were a lot more, but even back then, they were the more like cinematic ones, or the ones that tried to sort of
overblow
how
important the thing was.
That sort of thing,
But I agree with that. It did seem a bit more direct, and like the more adverts in the UK get into trying to play mind games with you and like convince you of things, the more painful they are to watch. And the more I find myself watching them and then going, like, I should make a list of companies never to buy from. Just
it makes me less
angry. I mean, there was one I saw the other day. It was like this Haribo advert, and there's this guy, this sort of like guy with glasses, and he's a Haribo, and he's just dancing, and I literally shut my eyes. I was like, this is just, I cannot comprehend how much I dislike this. But even because we went to a movie theatre. And the difference, you know, of a cinema here versus.
I mean, it was pretty similar, but
I mean the ads. Because if you've been recently to like an Odeon and seen,
they are definitely different.
There's lots of military ads at the moment.
In this country.
In this country, there are actually. That's true.
The countryside is quite different too.
The countryside feels.
It's like night and day, really. Just the scale. I mean, just in general, the scale of everything.
You were saying like how wide the roads are and stuff. Just everything you see is much bigger. Although I didn't think the portion sizes were much bigger.
It depends. I think it depends where you go. Because there are places where you went where it was literally that sort of size plate. But then other places, you know, the UK, I guess, has gotten bigger portions over the years anyway. So.
We're probably used to like things which are approaching American standard anyway.
I noticed that a lot more of their food packaging is plastic.
Right. What relative to like?
Well, there's certain, let's say, some people call healthy foods.
Right.
Like you know, stuff, let's say, made with nuts and dates and raisins and things like this. And in the UK, it seems like a lot of those companies that make those foods, they'll make a big point of having paper packaging. But I noticed that in Whole Foods, let's say, in Whole Foods in London, most of the kind of healthier, sweet snacks are going to be in recyclable or paper packaging. But over there, almost everything that I saw, apart from a few, was just plastic, non-recyclable, pure plastic.
Although I think for just produce like fruit and vegetables and stuff, I saw. Because sometimes here you have ridiculous packet, like I don't know if you've ever been to M&S and seen like 4 potatoes in a plastic bag with a separate polystyrene
they have the loose
box for each of them.
They
stuff. Have a lot more loose produce.
See, that's like the crossover of the snacks, because obviously there you just have peaches and stuff, and then here it's like apples in a plastic bag, strawberries in a massive plastic thing, and it's like,
I think another thing that I kind of pointed out, which I noticed with all the previous times we've been out there, is sort of like graphic design of things feels very like early 2000s, 90s.
Yeah.
Compared, if it almost feels like, even just in a supermarket, the way it's designed and like the packaging and the choice of the flooring and the walls and stuff, feels like how I kind of remember the early 2000s being here.
Yeah.
Whereas the UK supermarkets are a lot more like sleek and modern and like European, I guess.
It's true. I think it was a bit of a shock coming back and suddenly seeing, like around Heathrow, it just made me think of the British office, like all the sort of like the grey small roads and the kind of smaller cars and vans.
It did feel weird coming back and everything just being shit.
Yeah. I do. There is something about London, I've got to say, that whenever I'm somewhere else, I always think there's something about London that I think is quite, like certain areas, you know, like Covent Garden and places
I can see that.
But it is interesting. There's almost, because there's so much space and so much sort of vast landscapes out there, and the distance is so great between things.
Yeah.
There is something that makes you feel really kind of like, well, it made me personally feel very like just sort of lost and floating.
Yeah, I did feel weirdly small.
Yeah.
Insignificant.
Because you're like, oh, it takes me half a day to walk, if, you know, just
Yeah.
up here. Whether here it's like, oh, you want to go to, you know, you could drive the whole, you know, you could drive to Scotland in probably like 7 hours or something.
Yeah, 7 hours. About 7 hours sounds right.
And you think that like, it's crazy because a lot of people we spoke to. It's funny, we went to this and we're in Fort Langley, and we sort of saying, what are you doing here? What? That's the other thing is interesting, is that I don't know if this is just like just a general thing, but people would say, why, like, what's the purpose of your travel?
Yeah.
And we'd say like vacation or holiday, you know. And some people seem surprised that we'd sort of go there.
Oh really? What, to that specific bit of the US or just to the
Yeah.
US in general?
Yeah, I just got that a few times. Like when we got to customs, the guy said, "So what are you travelling for?" And we said, "Oh, just a vacation." He said, "What's the occasion?"
Oh right.
And we said, "Oh no, we're just sort of like, you know."
Yeah,
And he just sort of went, And I don't know if that was just that guy.
Oh,
I've had him a
okay.
few times throughout the holiday,
Yeah.
but it almost seemed like maybe it's because maybe someone used the word holiday and they were thinking
Yeah, I think that
holiday
might-
in
Oh,
the
that's
sense
probably
of
what yeah, that's true actually.
of like, what holiday is it? Easter, Christmas, you know,
Yeah,
as opposed
yeah.
to vacation.
Yeah, maybe they thought it was some like religious occasion
Yeah.
that they didn't know about or something.
It is, yeah. It's funny coming back and the sort of robotic scanner that's supposed to
Yeah.
make getting into the UK, if you're a UK or European citizen, easier. And you stand and it just does a video and it
I
takes
feel like
like
there's a
4
lot of
times
that sort of
longer.
thing in the UK, which you realise when you're out there, things are a bit more, not old-fashioned, but kind of maybe just very straightforward, like electronics and I don't know what the word would be, like a public, it's that kind of thing. But in the UK, it's more like everything has to be very high-tech and
Yeah.
kind of
I know
ends
what
up
you mean.
being more complicated than it needs to be.
complicated
Yeah.
result, yeah.
And an interesting observation is something I'd read about, and it's a proposal of an idea which not living in America, I don't know how much truth there is to, but the idea that in the UK obviously you have a class system
Yeah.
of, you know, upper class, middle class, working class, typically, and then over there they say you've got the sort of the money class where the class division is, even though it is here, you can have someone who, let's say, someone would say, oh, they're upper class, but they could be, you know, have no money in the bank. You'd have someone who's, you know,
That's true. It's
Yeah.
a cultural thing. Like someone could be like monetarily middle class, but consider
Yeah.
themselves working class and have a working class accent, and everyone would
Yeah.
call them working class.
and oftentimes people who someone could consider as working class would be very well off, you know, because obviously
Yeah.
trade
Yeah.
jobs can pay very well. But then you think it's interesting how we have this kind of historically kind of influenced system of division, you know,
Yeah.
between classes.
Definitely a big thing in the UK.
I did ask this girl, an American girl, who I think this might have actually been in the UK, but I'm not sure. I said, like, what was your first observations about someone British when he came to London, like, that struck you? And she said, actually, it may have been in Canada, but it was something like, British people take the longest route to say
Yeah.
something.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, where it's like, and it's interesting because even like on emails, if I'm emailing someone who's in America, sometimes I'll be like, oh, hello, hope you're well, blah, 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 just so you know, blah, 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 I just wanted to mention all this, and it's like such, so much fluff in it, and then I'll get a reply like, okay, 10 o'clock tomorrow, ?
Right.
And I'm obviously that, again, this is specific to certain individuals, but I do think that it's going back to what we said earlier, there is this sort of more direct attitude perhaps, where it's kind of more, let's get to the point, let's not waste time.
Yeah.
Over here maybe it's a bit more kind of, I don't know,
some kind
Natter on a bit.
cultural, I don't know whether it's a cultural necessity, but almost in order to come across as polite, you sort of have to put a load of fluff around it.
Yeah, I think in certain areas we went, let's say like Port Angeles or Seattle, but more so Port Angeles, it seemed to me that in general the expression of masculinity in men was quite different, and it seemed perhaps certain, let's say, middle-aged men in the UK, to me, on a certain level, seem a lot more feminised.
I get that actually.
Yeah, I sort of
Like
see what you
seem a lot
mean.
kind
Yeah.
of more timid.
Or maybe just our idea
not
of
necessarily timid.
masculinity isn't quite as masculine and like macho as the American one.
Because you just see these massive trucks coming down with like "fuck Biden" all them thing, and all these like, eagle, this is America, and all the flags. It seems like there's this real kind of like.
And I guess you could say you've got the sort of like football crowd in the UK who've always wearing like football shirts and Union Jacks.
That is true.
Very.
But what I mean is, what I find interesting is that the same, let's say, economic and age classification. Let's say a dad who's 45 and he's having a barbecue with his children. If I think about that in the UK, I think about some guy who's like in a sort of, he's quite sort of, no, all right, thank you, blah blah blah. Maybe it's the going
Hugh
back.
Dennis
Hugh Dennis outnumbered versus out there. It's a bit more like, guy's got a beer in his hand and he's like, obviously it would, Les Dennis probably would have a beer as well, but beer in his hand and he's all talking about sports. And I mean, it's like you picked up what's interesting is that when you stayed with some people who were younger, a lot of their conversation was about products.
Yeah, that's something I felt like I noticed, is that there was a lot of talk about fast food and like what time is this place open, what is this better than that place, and like product, cars, guns, things like that. Like I guess because America is so focused on consumerism. And then I guess there's also a lot of that in the UK. A lot of people talking about McDonald's, and there's like a massive conversation topic and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I have heard conversations like that in the UK, but it would be interesting to analyse it.
Yeah, it's one of those things I couldn't really pinpoint. I just kind of noticed a lot of the conversations seemed to be
like it got to the point
centred around that kind of thing.
Yeah, that is interesting, because there was, I think linguist man Dan Everett said that when he went and lived with this tribe in the Amazon, he noticed that they didn't talk about very many topics, and then he realised that English speakers don't talk about very many topics either, really. If you actually listen to them, there's only 5 or 6 things we really talk about. I wonder if like different cultural groups within the Anglosphere just like talk about different topics more than like one topic will be slightly more focused on or something. But we could cut it unless people have anything else to say.
I guess the only other thing is that I guess with everything, there's at the core of it, there's almost that kind of like American dream, manifest destiny sort of idea, which I feel like is still like sort of ingrained in American culture. This idea of like anyone can succeed, and you just got to come out on top, and anyone can be the best, and anyone can make it. Whereas I feel like the UK is almost a bit more like, you're not going to make it, so
stay in that place. So
I was just going to agree.
Well, there was, that exchange is a perfect example of something that I feel is more common in the UK than in the US.
Oh, what, like being deferential to other people? Kind of thing.
Like you went to talk and I went to talk, and then we said, I'm sorry, let you, I'll know you. And it seems that there's this I almost feel like, I agree with that. I think, I kind of felt that with the kind of American dream thing, I even saw that in the homeless a lot. Like I saw there was this this real difference, maybe, where there's less of a dependence on other people, where it seemed like they're a lot more walking around doing their thing, versus in, let's say, London, it's a lot more, you see a lot more people sat doing something or asking for money. But
I noticed that actually.
But I feel like I understood the kind of, there's something about being in America that almost like the soul of the place, that somehow there's a feeling you get, which I don't think always translates in certain films.
Yeah.
Where it's it's like you get off the plane and it's almost the air is just different, and then you just see certain things, like a certain advertisement or a certain...
Like when you watch an American film while you're in America, you kind of
makes
just
sense.
suddenly clicks.
Understand.
Yeah.
Like you can really relate to it a lot more, I think.
Yeah, I
It's
didn't
true.
watch any, but maybe I should next time.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was an interesting experience.
I think so. I think I did miss I loved the scale of the kind of the outdoors there.
Yeah, so did I.
But I think there was a part of me that missed perhaps some of the British trees and plants, and
Yeah, there's always something very
Some of the-
charming about the UK.
and the sort of biodiversity you get.
I definitely miss it if I moved there a lot. I miss it a lot because I
I
still
think
feel,
both places kind of have their own
Yeah, definitely.
personality
Yeah.
that I really love for different reasons.
Yeah, if I was born there and brought up there, I think it would feel very nice, like home, like I lived somewhere nice.